Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Sunil Amrith, Chair of the South Asian Studies Council at Yale, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you to the first of a new series that is a collaboration between the Economic Growth Center and the South Asian Studies Council at Yale, the South Asia Development Dialogues, Economic Policy Lessons from History. And our aim was to open a conversation on how insights from historians might contribute to our understanding of some of the most pressing development challenges in South Asia. We hope to stimulate interaction across fields on our campus and to bring in a wide audience and a wide range of voices from around the world. Just a quick preview of our next session, which will be on the 11th of November at the same time, 10 a.m. Eastern time, which will focus directly on the COVID-19 pandemic in South Asia, in particular in relation to migrant workers. And that will be a conversation between the historian Kavita Sivaramakrishnan and the economist Charity Troyer Moore. So I'd like to hand over now to our moderator, Catherine Cheney. Catherine is reporter for DevEx, a media platform for the global development community, and a Yale alum. Catherine, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Sunil. Thrilled to be here. So as Sunil mentioned, I'm a reporter for DevEx, and I cover the role of the West Coast of the United States in global development, including the role of technology and philanthropy. And probably we'll be getting into some of those themes later today, but I want to start with official development assistance. So official development assistance, as many of you know, and part of why you're joining to discuss this dynamic, often has as much to do with the political aims of the donor countries as the development goals of the recipients. And we saw a very concrete example of this when the UK aligned its political and development goals, merging the Foreign Office and the Department for International Development earlier this year, which is certainly something we'll get into with one of our panelists who's intimately involved with that topic. At the same time, as I was sort of previewing earlier, private philanthropic organizations have taken a larger role in international development, with some institutions like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which I cover closely, giving yearly contributions greater than the aid budgets of many countries. So now we have some big questions this year. How should the crises of COVID-19, inequality, and climate change, which are really crossing borders and sparking political turmoil in rich and poor countries alike, change the conversation on aid? Just as one example, the COVID-19 pandemic, as many of you may know, has led to a rise in direct cash payments to the poor. And many development experts are arguing that this may be a way to avoid relief becoming a tool of geopolitical power. So we're going to dive into these topics with our panelists. I'll briefly introduce them and then jump into a conversation. David Engerman is the Leitner International Interdisciplinary Professor of History at Yale University, and his book, The Price of Aid, The Economic Cold War in India, discusses how superpowers turn to foreign aid as a tool of the Cold War. We'll hear some key messages from that book in a moment. Rohini Pande is the Henry J. Hines II Professor of Economics and Director of the Economic Growth Center at Yale, which is bringing us this series. And her research has examined the political economy of aid and empowerment of the poor in developing countries. And Rory Stewart is a former member of Parliament and Secretary of State for International Development in the UK. He has written extensively about travel, politics, and development, and argued against the merging of DFID and the Foreign Office that I mentioned earlier. So just to kind of tee up this topic, and then I look forward to hearing from our panelists. In preparation for this session, I was reading a piece about that merger, and I was struck by this line that I wanted to share. The development community adopted the idea that history was a distraction and that fighting poverty meant only looking forward. Aid, in turn, was designed to make poverty history. So as a reporter covering this space, I come up across that time and again, that all too often debates over foreign aid leave out history. And during this really critical turning point in the fight for racial equality, there are calls to decolonize international development. That's something we've covered very closely at DevEx. In order to do so, though, the industry needs to confront how it got here, and that means looking at history. So it's very timely we hold this conversation today. We do want it to be just that, a conversation. So please drop any questions you have into the Q&A function if you're joining us on Zoom, or into the comments if you're joining us on Facebook. So I want to start with that basic question. Why is history relevant to foreign aid? That's what brings us here today. I think we all agree that it is relevant, but why focus on history? Why not just focus on what works best to reach current development goals, what many call the best buys in development policy? I'll start with, I'll start with Rohini on that question.
I have the least to say, or maybe the least interesting things to say. So let me just really set it up for David and Rory by saying that I think very often, if I think of the best buys conversation, it's one that believes that we can remove context and have a discussion of really what is value for money. So we can identify what is the cheapest way of getting resources to individuals, and then hopefully take that across the world and get countries to buy in. And it's an interesting view because it's a view that it's not clear who's doing the buying. Are we looking to see country governments buying? Are we looking to see international agencies buying? Or is there some way in which we should possibly be asking about what citizens in these countries want to buy? So maybe, Catherine, all I'm going to do is add on to your questions and then ask David to give us a perspective from history, and then Rory to tell us what he thinks about it as a practitioner.
Sounds great. And yes, I know David, in a moment, I know you'll be drawing on some of the key takeaways from your book. But first, I do just want to hear from each panelist just on this broader question: why is history relevant to foreign aid?
Well, the question obviously cuts right to my heart, right, as a historian. But I mean, I think in this case, as Rohini said, studying history is really about context. We need to know more about who donors are interacting with and the situations in which they operate, whether those donors are the World Bank, international organizations, national organizations like USAID or the British, the FID in its latest incarnation, or NGOs. And it's true at least two levels. One is about actual conditions. History of development is littered with mistaken assumptions. Take, for instance, in the aftermath of the Soviet collapse, where knowledge of the Soviet system was deemed not just unnecessary, but perhaps even harmful. After all, the system had failed so many of its central goals. Now, I'm not saying that Jeffrey Sachs, Anders Ostlund, Andrei Schleifer, and so on should have been looking sympathetically at the moribund Soviet economic system, but their failure to reckon with the institutions that existed before the start of their transition go a long way to explain its failure. Before hooking up the electrodes for shock therapy, in other words, they might have paid more attention to the body those were attached to. And then secondly, our subjective perspectives. Our interlocutors come into conversations with their own perspectives shaped by past events. Even if we see those events differently, it's really crucial to know how they understand the questions at heart.
Thank you. That was a really powerful analogy when you're talking about shock therapy and paying attention to the body. What it makes me think is that there are a lot of conversations about the future of aid and innovation in international development, but those conversations can't happen without understanding the body, if you will, the context that precedes these conversations. And Rory, would love to hand it over to you, again, just to go around and meet our panelists. What brings you to this conversation? Why is it that you think history is so relevant to discussions around aid?
So my instinct is that when I'm talking about history, I'm talking about it probably in terms of cultural context, anthropology, the internal politics, both of the donor country, so the US or the UK, for example, giving the money, and the recipient country. And the oddity about international development is that there is a tendency, obviously, to see it in very narrow technocratic terms. In other words, to try to have some idea that there is some mathematical model that allows you to generate what the best buy is, or in the British jargon, where the value for money lies. The truth of the matter is that, to try to connect what Rohini and David were saying, is that attempts to do that run very, very starkly against issues of culture, context, values. Just to run you through some examples. So problem number one, it may lead you to ignore certain sectors entirely. So I have had a couple of long arguments with Bill Gates, who has a tendency to say that he has established that money should be put into health, but should not be put into education in developing countries, because he somehow calculated that he gets more value for money out of his dollar investment in health. It often leaves aside the question of the particular regime with which you're working. So it might be ignoring the fact that you might find it more convenient to put money into Rwanda or Ethiopia because they seem to be spending your money better, and be ignoring the human rights context where you're operating. Thirdly, it may distract you from other equally important values. So your value for money might convince you that your best buy is to build a large oil-powered fuel generating station with catastrophic impacts on climate change. or another program may have catastrophic impacts on biodiversity. And then finally, these types of attempt to see these things in very sort of mathematical, neutral technocratic terms mean that you don't take into account the people who are actually giving the money, if you're talking about bilateral programs, which is that the British taxpayer is being asked to provide, maybe 14 billion pounds, $18 billion worth of assistance a year, has quite strong views themselves on the kind of things they want to support and the kind of things they don't want to support. So, for example, cash transfers is something that seems to be, a good buy, but it's something that is extremely difficult to explain to a taxpayer. Why should I be taking £20 from my pocket and putting it £20 into the pocket of somebody in another country? It goes totally against all that they were told about development. So I think, if I broaden history out to a broader conversation about values, context, culture, I think that's where I see the problem with development.
Thank you so much. And it is worth noting that while entities like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation may be giving as much as some countries, countries are accountable to their citizens, and that brings up a constraint, if you will.
And Catherine, remember also that yes, they give a lot, but when I was running DFID, we gave far more than they do. I mean, there is a slight tendency to do that. I mean, we were spending probably at our height nearly $20 billion a year. So it's also important to remember that these states, these bilateral donors, are still very, very major players in this.
Absolutely.
Both directly and through their funding in the multilateral system. And we can't pretend that West Coast philanthropists have somehow taken over the whole machine. Yeah.
And in fact, the Gates Foundation will be among the first to say that spending needs to continue. And we come nowhere close to the spending of the UK, of the US. So in fact, a huge part of what they do is advocacy for bilateral development assistance, which is far and above what the Gates Foundation or any other philanthropic entity can give. So David, I wanted to go to you and talk about some of the key points in your book, which gets directly to our conversation today, and lessons from your book in terms of what can often be political, the political nature of foreign aid.
Great. I mean, I'd like to talk, I guess, about just a couple of points here. And I should preface it by saying the usual role of a historian at a moment like this is to say, no matter what the topic, to say that it started earlier and it's more complicated. And I'll be true to form in this, so we'll probably focus a little more on the complexity, the latter one, than on the former. As you said, Catherine, my book is dealt with American and Soviet aid to independent India from the mid-50s until the eve of the Indian emergence in 1975. There's some claims that are probably more of interest to historians, but the ones I would want to emphasize here, I think are actually building already on what Rohini and Rory have said. First is that agreements are often cases between governments, but programs operate within complex and divided societies. And this applies, as Rory suggested, both to donors and to recipients. So in my work on in the price of aid, it's how America, there was an India lobby within the United States, kind of crossing government to non-governmental actors. There was America and a Soviet lobby within within India, not as formal entities, but as clusters of people who saw their interests best aligned with building an economic relationship with one or another of the superpower. Donors very often think that they're the ones bringing all the ideas, but in fact, they're being invited into an ongoing debate. Sometimes they recognize this, sometimes they don't, and often for reasons, they're being invited for reasons they don't always comprehend. The invitations, I think, are motivated, in the case of India here, motivated by a desire to promote policies. So the groups who are interested in India, who are interested in rapid industrialization through in a kind of regime of planning, and it's hardly a surprise that they would look to the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc for support. Now here I mean both ideological as well as material support. There were also those interested in India, interested in opening to imports and to direct investment. And it's hardly a surprise that they would look to Western nations and to Western institutions like the World Bank for doing this. Then became a resource, a political resource, an ideological resource, and of course a financial resource for groups in India as they argued about different visions of India's economic future. In other words, my work was just on the Cold War here. In other words, for donors, development could be a Cold War weapon. This was our way to win hearts and minds of the third world, as we said back in the day. But for recipients, Cold War was a development weapon. The Cold War was a kind of a resource that they could draw on to promote policies that they'd been interested in for their own independent reasons. Second point, I think this is already following from why history matters for all of our answers to it, is never underestimate the value of local knowledge for donors or for recipients. My book before The Price of Aid was called Know Your Enemy, and I suppose in a way I could have named this book Know Your Partners. Given the complex politics at work, there's a really striking need to understand internal dynamics at the social and cultural levels, as Rory rightly indicated, at economic levels and at political levels. And you can see in the course of an archival record, looking at this, foreign policy debates within the Soviet Union or within the United States aid apparatuses, you can see that as reports make their way up the organization chart, they get any kind of local context gets leached from it, as you get, as it gets higher up, it gets closer and closer to what economist Bill Easterly referred to as the blank slate, in which there's no operation other than what's happening. And here, actually, I'd be really interested in hearing Rory's experience here, having worked both at the local level and at the cabinet level, about how he sees expertise operating. So as the expertise is leached from it, it kind of frames any given problem as if it came into being at the very moment in which we turned our attentions to it. I mean, babies have to learn about object permanence, that objects exist even before we see them. And development experts actually need to act the same way, even if it's not by playing peekaboo. And here, I think, again, the best example is actually not from my book, but from my experience of dissertation research in Moscow in the 1990s and watching the kind of arguments about shock therapy, as if somehow knowing the history was not just neutral, but actually deleterious to the efforts underway. Local knowledge, of course, also helps recipients. B.K. Nehru, for instance, represented India and Washington for most of the 60s, and he was very, very effective at understanding the internal debates going on, working with senators, with staffers, with executive branch officials, and he had a keen understanding of the possibilities as well as knowledge of how to turn those into realities. And so again, local knowledge really matters here. Final point is that there's no such thing as apolitical or neutral aid. All aid comes with baggage of normative assumptions, sometimes explicit, more often not, about how things should be. So community development programs that emerged in the 1950s and 60s came to be bottom up, but were claimed to be bottom up, but in fact were really designed around a kind of vision of empowerment in which the community developers knew, I think, the right answer. It also had embedded within it a notion that the village was actually the right place to solve all these questions, and that the village, and this is kind of part of the assumption, that the villages were themselves communities with single purposes and single kind of single set of interests. Whereas in fact, these were rigidly hierarchical places. And I think of this one episode about taking a PR photograph in a village about a community development program. And the village panchayat, the kind of village council, was really torn about how to handle this, because there was a Dalit who had been, it was a so-called untouchable, was a member of the panchayat by American kind of design, and how to situate him compared to the other members. And they eventually situated him sitting on the ground in front of everyone else, but just off the carpet in which the other chairs, the chairs of all the other members were seated, right? And it's a sense that Americans kind of walked into that without a kind of deep understanding of the dilemmas of how villages operated. The politics of aid is also an issue even before the advent of conditionality, where donors link aid to specific problems and policies and programs. Obviously, conditionality became very explicit in the 1980s with the World Bank and IMF efforts. But like a good historian, I want to argue that it started earlier. In fact, the USAID director in India in the 1960s, a revered economist from Princeton, wrote us a memo memo to Washington about what increased aid could buy. It was a 2-page long list, and really was trying to use aid quite explicitly to reshape an entire economic and, for that matter, political system. So all of these 3 points here about the lack of, there's no such thing as neutral aid, the importance of local knowledge, about the complexity of working with organizations, are all kind of part of a historian's worldview, for better and I suppose for worse, which is to focus on the specificities of time and place, a kind of call for modesty, and a kind of a demand, a high level of local expertise. And I'd say that in the United States, probably even more than in the UK, this impulse toward regional expertise has eroded substantially in American universities in recent decades. Fortunately, actually, Yale's Macmillan Center holds this banner high, much to our credit, and a sense that all problems are global. But the problem is that even as problems are global, all global actors operate in local context. They speak local languages, and they're shaped by local histories and events. So all those are kind of drawing back toward the first question of why, so from my book, to why history would matter. Thanks.
Thank you so much, David. And as Rohini mentioned earlier, part of the way this event was designed is to hear the perspective of a historian and the perspective of a practitioner. And I think it's such a useful combination of perspectives because of the very problem we set out to address at the beginning, that so often these discussions of foreign aid are detached from any sense of history or context. So that was really, really useful context. And I saw Rory jotting down some notes. I'm sure you have some points you want to respond to. Rory, can you talk a little bit about any reactions you have to what David had to say, including that point on expertise, and maybe connect that with some of your views on the DFID FCO merger that we discussed earlier?
Well, I mean, firstly, I obviously strongly agree with David. It's very, very striking the way in which approaches are framed to these countries as though they're all the same. So a particular type of technocrat in the bank in the World Bank in the early 2000s would be very liable to say, oh, we're going to take the lessons from Nepal and apply them to Ethiopia. Or we're going to take the same state building framework that we have for Afghanistan, and then we're going to bring it to South Sudan. And there are various things going on there. I mean, one of them is this very odd model, which is very deeply rooted in the way development practitioners think, which is that somehow if there's a problem, it can be articulated in terms of, we've got to learn what the best practice is, then we've got to do the capacity building, and then there's going to be this political will which is going to drive it through. It's actually a very offensive model. If you translate that jargon into what you're really saying, you're basically saying that the people in this country don't really know what they're doing, they're not properly educated, and they're idle. Right? But the truth of the matter is, the reason that things don't happen in these countries is, of course, much more to do with power, politics, and the way that these things operate. Now, that then brings us to the problem. The problem is that although development practitioners now are better than they used to be at talking about the importance of politics, they don't actually know anything about politics. They're not very comfortable with politics, and they don't really want to get very involved in politics. So the World Bank will produce a report saying it's all about power and politics. But the truth of the matter is that actually our people on the ground know less about that stuff than they did 40 years ago. So if you look at a development agency like DFID, they've got rid of almost all their area experts, right? And they've also got rid of sector experts. So there are no longer health specialists, education specialists, increasing use of generalists. And those that are on the ground at all very rarely leave their offices now for a range of reasons, both the amount of paperwork they have to do and the security constraints that make it very difficult for them to actually get into the field. These institutions defend themselves in very odd ways. So they often say that if you challenge and say, why don't you have anybody out there on the ground actually looking at that health clinic? There is a rather sort of clever rhetorical retort, which is to say, oh, no, that would be very colonial. You know, we don't approve anymore of the idea of having foreigners in somebody else's country, studying that country, getting out on the ground and making fussy comments about the fact that this clinic we've built in Nigeria has human excrement on the floor, no medicines on the shelves. I mean, I'm talking about a real clinic, right? I was taken out to see this clinic, literally. I turn up, it's a DFID project. I turn up and there is poo on the floor. There's no medicines on the shelves. There's no patients. There's an electric fan, but there's no electricity anywhere nearby. It's a complete disgrace, right? But the institution doesn't think that's their problem. Now, there are a range of reasons why that's true. That's partly about lawyers and risk aversion. It's partly also about the fact that the development efforts abroad don't matter that much to domestic politics. Right? It never really features in Britain that crappy clinic. Doesn't matter. right? And if it doesn't matter, if nobody loses their job about it, if it doesn't make it onto the front page of the newspapers, it's very difficult to invest in the painful things that you'd have to do if you wanted that clinic to look better, right? So I believe that in DFID, what we needed to do is double the number of our staff on the ground. We needed to invest deeply in language expertise. We needed to develop new cadres. But from the Treasury's point of view, this is horrifying. I'm talking about doubling the number of civil servants. And in fact, you can make a lovely argument that sounds plausible about why that's a bad idea. No, we want our money to be having impact on the ground. We don't want to be wasting it on overheads. Why are you trying to increase the amount you spend on staff from 4% to 10% of the budget? We want all the money to hit the ground. And then there's an attempt to pretend that somebody else is doing it. Maybe we don't need to have this expertise because the NGOs have the expertise or the World Bank has the expertise. So we can just be a sort of contract manager where we process contracts, invoices, and receipts, and other people do it. The idea that to even allocate the money, you need to have knowledge has sort of fallen away. So anyway, that's a long spiel, but that's my response to David, and I'll stop there and hand back to you because I'm sure there are many other things you want to talk about.
Very helpful, Rory. I was struck by one thing you said. I just wanted to ask you a follow-up. When you talked about how development efforts abroad just don't matter much when it comes to domestic politics, and that if it doesn't matter, then it's difficult to invest in change. Any thoughts on how to make it matter more? I keep hearing people talking about how this is a real turning point. COVID-19 is kind of demonstrating to the world how interconnected we all are. I mean, could that make it matter more to domestic politics, or what could change that, if anything?
I mean, it is incredibly difficult. We were always tempted with this subject to imagine that the reason why the British public was not more supportive of development aid is because we didn't talk about it enough. Right? It's always tempting to see this as a sort of failure of political leadership. The analogy is with Brexit. Why did Brexit happen? Because the British political elite for 40 years weren't making enough effort into promoting Europe. But of course, the chicken and the egg problem for the politician, which people don't understand, is the reason people didn't talk about Europe and the reason people don't talk about development aid is the voters don't want to hear about it. And it's very, very difficult to change voters' minds when they are fundamentally have an antipathy towards it. The problem in Britain is that we were spending nearly $20 billion a year, so we're spending 1.5% of people's taxes at a time of extreme austerity. Right? Every other government department was being cut. The development budget was being defended. So, last time I saw Rohini in one of my ministerial offices, I was sitting in the Ministry of Justice. I'd just been moved to be the prisons minister. We have 85,000 prisoners sitting in cells designed for 65,000. We're in the process of having to rent out the entire bottom of our ministry building to try to generate another £8 million a year. So we just removed 3 floors from our building. Meanwhile, DFID is happily writing £250 million checks for education programs in Ethiopia. It's very, very difficult, right? Not only can I not convince the public, I can't even convince my colleagues around the cabinet table about what the hell's happening. They just cannot understand in a world in which, I can't get £1.5 million to keep a national park open in Britain. Why I have, as I will in, a £400 million program in Pakistan. It's too easy for people to turn around and say, wait a sec, that's 1% of the budget of the Pakistan army. Why are you doing this? Why are you giving these people the money? And that then draws you into this very disingenuous conversations where people try to invent stories, right? We've got to give them money because if we don't give these other people money, it's going to be an existential threat to us, right? Or we've got to give these people money because it's going to be good for our trade, or we're going to give these people money because and of course, all of that leads you down very, very weird paths. I mean, I saw this most directly, and I'll finish on this, when I was a practitioner in Afghanistan, where every single dollar we spent had to be justified in terms of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. So, you do a little proposal for building a primary school, and the US government would insist that you fill in a whole paragraph about how your primary school was winning the war against the Taliban. Now, of course, your primary school had nothing to do with winning the war against the Taliban, right? It was a complete different area of Afghanistan. And you'd need to be making a very, very complex argument for why exactly your primary education is somehow going to lead to the victory in the counterinsurgency campaign. But you end up in those worlds because we find it very, very difficult to really talk realistically about what on earth we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. And that one of the questions I hope we can get to in our discussion is I was curious to ask our panelists about advocacy for global development, and Rory pointed on this, so I just wanted to highlight it. Often these advocacy efforts to maintain or increase official development assistance narrow in on aid as a matter of self-interest, kind of as you just pointed to, right? Like, it matters for us in this way. And might that be problematic given the connection with history that we're talking about today? So we'll see if we have time to get into that later in our discussion. But I want to bring it to Rohini and ask, we've just gone into a deep dive in the UK. I'd like to zoom out now and hear from you any other examples of aid being tied to the political aims of donor countries. I know that in reading a little bit about David's book, there was the connection drawn to China's spending in Africa, for example, as a tool of development assistance, but also absolutely a tool of politics. So can you help us zoom out and just understand from your perspective some other examples we're seeing today of this?
Yeah. Thanks, Catherine. I'd say one of the biggest examples that we've started to see is this coming in of what we think of banks providing infrastructure loans. So one thing to remember even about the World Bank is a lot of what the bank is doing is providing subsidized loans. And so when you say China has come in, yes, China has come in. It's come in as a player that is through, for instance, the AIIB Bank is increasing investments in infrastructure. And the one concern you often hear about is, well, they may not, for instance, have as many environmental safeguards as the bank does, or perhaps, they feel, or now FCDA would ask for. So I think, what we're seeing is the emergence of two types of additional players to the traditional multilateral and bilateral model. One is obviously just China, which is a big player, especially in Africa. And then I think, as you alluded to yourself, was this sort of tech philanthropy, or more generally philanthropy. And I think one of the interesting things about philanthropy is that their aims are not political, but perhaps in ways that it's not clear whose objective it is beyond that of the philanthropist, right? So, the negative side of thinking of bilateral aid is that we might worry is being driven by US's current political ambition. The plus is there are at least two governments that are negotiating with each other, and very often these are democratic governments, or they have some semblance of needing to turn to the citizens. Once you have large-scale philanthropy come in, it becomes, what is that objective? And I think that pushes very often to then saying, let's have value for money. Let's try to figure out how we can reach some objective which is defined, but we don't know exactly how it's defined. The one other thing I'd say, and I think this is just to respond a bit to Rory, and I think this is an ongoing discussion we've been having, is, context is important. I think it's extremely important to have local knowledge. But there was a time when this led to a lot of nihilism about aid. So I think, again, actually building on what David was saying about the experience in Soviet Union, I think soon after that, we started seeing a lot of discussion of sort of Bill Easterly writing about how, aid is leading to just a lot of corruption, a lot of bad projects. And I think it's worth remembering that a lot of the push towards sort of evidence-based policy making by economists came really from a point of saying is, can we find things that work? And so, while it may have gotten now too divorced from context, it did come from a point of saying that let's not just do anecdotes when we're talking about development, because it's you'll get the extremes. You'll get those who say, it works, we just need the money. And then you'll have those who say there are definitely 3 cases of corruption. And then how does a policymaker respond? And so that, I think, is still a value that economics and empirical work can bring. I think that the important question is, how do we get it to answer questions about governance, not just about whether cash transfers increase income?
Thank
you.
Can I
jump in on this, Catherine? I'm sorry. I'm struck that I agree completely with the sort of the rise of kind of corruption as an issue in development politics, in kind of development community, and the need to measure effectiveness. But I wonder how much, as we've insisted on measuring effectiveness and have gotten better and better at it, that it's actually forced us into smaller and smaller scale kinds of interventions. That there are some kinds of interventions that are actually very hard to measure with the same rigor. And so for all that randomized controlled trials have brought us, do they then discourage other kinds of programs that would have a more diffuse if probably a less rigorous way of measuring them. So the original rounds of interventions in the 50s and 60s were almost all macro level work, and of course very hard to. There's no India control sample you can use, right? But I guess I'm worried about the turn to effectiveness has implications beyond just spending the dollars or pounds better. That has implications about what kind of projects can even be measured according to that. Do you find that in the kind of the discussions of UC aid unfolding, Rohini and Rory?
That's a great question. I was just going to ask Rory if you had any reactions on this emphasis on effectiveness, how that's played out in the UK.
So I think there is the problem, as David says, on the macro level. I totally take on board Rohini's point that there was huge political pressure, understandably, to try to have some evidence. But there are a couple of other issues that take place here. One of them is that even at the local community level, set aside David's bigger infrastructure projects, the effect of this type of analysis, this type of economic analysis, has been to totally destroy integrated development approaches. For some reason, the academics find it much easier to break things down so that you end up in a world in which you do, let's say you're working in a community, you're working in a village. There's intuitively enormous amount of sense in thinking that what you really want to do if you're working in a village community is simultaneously work on improving their clinic, their primary school, their water supply, their electricity, their sanitation, their cultural heritage, their landscape, their businesses, right? But that is almost impossible for an academic to analyze. So what happens is that the donors end up producing programs that say, we only fund health, we only fund education. And it becomes almost impossible to get any donor to come with you to take an integrated approach to a community. You have to run around desperately trying to say, well, you pay for my health clinic and I'll try to get a bit of money for education here, etc. And you can never do it because the donors also, this is another problem, as they cut their staff, want to give $200 million at a time. They don't like giving small grants. The second problem, though, somehow, which is happening, notwithstanding all the measurement, is that, and probably in a way that must be deeply disturbing for the academics, is that the country set metrics. So in Britain, we would have a metric on getting 100 million girls into school, right? It'd be very important, put in a manifesto, etc. We would boast about getting female enrollment in Malawi in primary school up to 93%. And then it would turn out that 87% of those girls at the end of 7 years were unable to read or write. They'd learned nothing after 7 years in these schools. But nobody really cared because they were able to boast that they got these girls into school. In fact, people began producing more and more bizarre arguments. Oh, well, it doesn't matter, they didn't learn anything. There are other benefits that economists have identified from sending girls to school, even if they don't learn anything in school, because they're less likely to get married early, or it's good for their health, or some other thing. Right? As though the school is simply some sort of holding pen to prevent them from doing other things. And when you then try to have a conversation about, well, what could we do to actually get these people reading and writing, then again, the value for money argument becomes difficult, because effectively you would have to probably, instead of spending $25 per girl per year, you might have to spend $75 per girl per year, right? And then you get into equity problems. Then everyone in DFID says, well, no, but you're telling me that we're going to abandon 2/3 of the girls in Malawi and only educate 1/3 of them. And then it's very difficult to say, but you're not educating anybody at the moment, right? So, you know, these mathematical games are absurd. And finally, you know, just while I'm thinking about this, David's point on history also extends to the fact that development agencies don't want to study their own history. So I tried, when I became a minister, to try to get DFID to fund a program looking at what they'd done in Malawi over the last 40 years. What did they achieve? They'd had these huge programs in Malawi over 40 years. What did they actually achieve? They wouldn't do it. All they could see was the political downside of the inevitable discovery that an enormous amount of what they'd done presumably had been a total waste of time. And nobody in the DFID office felt that it was any of their business to understand what their predecessors had thought they'd been doing for the last 40 years. And no data, no information is available to them to allow them to even do that. Okay, finish from me.
A very powerful point when you say development agencies don't want to study their own history. I think part of the reason why these conversations on aid are often divorced from history is because it's sometimes in the interests of the major players in aid to leave history aside. So that's a really, really powerful point. I want to start bringing in some questions from the audience, but first, David or Rohini, did you have anything you wanted to say in response to Rory? Otherwise, I can jump in with some questions from the audience. Go ahead.
One quick thought, which was, on this idea of the integrated approach, and I wanted to link it to Rory's earlier thought that, David need to really increase its presence on the ground. I was curious. I mean, you had a throwaway remark that people push it aside by saying that's sort of kind of colonial and imperialist thinking. But I was curious about, what about the view of saying that let the local village government do the integrated approach, and what DFID should be doing is figuring out how to get that governance structure to work, and then then they can do everything if they want to do it.
So the response to that is, of course, about the fundamental problem with much of this analysis, which is the gap between ought and can. So I think there's no doubt at all that theorists are absolutely correct that fundamentally the problems in many of these countries relate to governance and also to security and to the rule of law and to civil society and many other things. And that therefore, theoretically, if it were possible somehow for an external actor to address these problems of governance, politics, civil society, rule of law, etc., that would solve many of the other problems, such as how you get the water supply, the electricity, and run a decent school. But of course, the truth of the matter is that we do not know how to do those things. I mean, at least in my experience, foreign donors are relatively good at building a decent water system or sewerage system, can be, with a certain amount of luck, able to run a decent clinic. What they're not able to do is remodel the entire Jordanian education system or Nigerian health system. And attempting to do so simply wastes money and distracts them from more useful things they could be doing. So anyway, that's the end of me.
And I guess I just have a thought. I'm thinking of the Rory's example of the Malawi health clinic. I'm not sure, or bringing 100 million girls in school. I'm not sure it's worse when the metrics are gamed and don't work, or when the metrics are gamed and they work. And I think a classic example for a lot of historians would be family planning / population control in India in the 60s and 70s. And this is pretty interesting because it's actually not just one force doing it, but this sort of network of people from Indian government, US government, population council, so NGOs, and so on, that really promoted family planning. But as that worked its way down the bureaucracy, it ended up with something resembling coerced sterilizations in the villages. And so in some ways, I'd be happier for having girls in school, but not learning to read and write. Then, I don't know which is worse, right? When the metrics distort by working, or the metrics distort by failing.
That's pretty grim. David seems to be saying there that some of what we do is so bad and so harmful that it's better if our programs are ineffective.
Yeah, that is a powerful point here. I see we have some questions coming in. Here we go. Yes. I have a question I want to bring in from an audience member. It relates to something I wanted to ask. So let me pull these together. Building on the conversation we just had, I wanted to ask how recipients of aid, we have to bring in the point of power. How can recipients of aid have more power over the form that aid should take? It relates to a question that someone posed. Is it possible to ever really place affected populations' priorities at the heart of humanitarian aid? Or is the concept of participation also a political tool? So I thought that was very well put. Any reactions to that?
I feel I'm talking too much. Let me try 1 second on this. I think the danger around community participation is not the theory of it, which of course has to be right. It's that in practice, it becomes pretty embarrassing. So This is true even actually in Britain, to be honest. I mean, and it's trebly true if you try to run one of these programs in Bangladesh or you try to run a program in Nepal. But as many people on the call will have experienced even within their own communities, political participation, community consultation, almost always feels to the community like a technocrat that wants to do something, trying to get permission to do it by running some fake process that involves you ticking various boxes. And one of the reasons that that happens is that there is always a huge disparity of power and knowledge between the person proposing the project and the person responding. So this is not just a question about Bangladesh. This is if you are doing a community consultation project in a national park in Britain, the environmentalist with their many, many degrees are in a very different position representing the government to the farmer on the ground who maybe has left school at 16, isn't able to manipulate the jargon in the same way. That becomes much more extreme when you're dealing with communities where class structures are very extreme. In many of these societies, we massively underestimate the fact that the people that are sent out to these communities are often from highly educated, even if they're locals. I mean, this is one of the mistakes development agencies make. They're like, oh, it's fine, my staff are Indian or my staff are Malawian, but actually their staff tend to be highly educated, elite people from cities are going out to villages, often with profound prejudices about the villages they're interacting with. And the consultation processes and the participation processes then become really, really grotesque.
Well, I could actually put a footnote perhaps to Rory, maybe that's the historian's job in something like this. And I think of the community development programs in the 60s, which had a kind of, I guess, a Peace Corps feel to them, right? We send people who are technocrats, but in the end, what happened was they sent energetic generalists who were university students in major metropolitan areas. So they were, as Rory suggested, local or in country. And yet the task was similar to the technocrats. And if you read some of the sort of exhortatory literature on community development, it's about, well, we need to help the villagers understand their own needs, and we can bring them to understand their own needs, which of course has embedded within it all kinds of assumptions, and is not likely to lead to a kind of candid discussion that would be free of the power politics between the visitor and the village, or even more notably within the village itself.
Thank you, David. And I've just discovered all these questions coming in. I've unlocked them in a part of the Zoom. I didn't realize they were hiding. So I'm gonna, in our last 10 minutes here, throw out a few rapid fire questions. There's a question that came in that I'd love to perhaps bring Rohini in on this. A question on how proponents of cash transfer programming can make their case versus more traditional aid programs. This is a moment when we're seeing a lot of interest in cash transfers, a lot of activity around cash transfers. How do proponents of those approaches seize this moment?
So let me start, but I think one of the things I'm reminded in making the case is how the British press responded to some of the cash transfer being paid for by DFID in Pakistan. So I'd love to hear Rory and any historical perspectives from David. I think you have to distinguish between humanitarian situations where I think no one would disagree with the value of either food programs or possibly cash programs if they're more effective in reaching. And I think right now, in some cases, that's the case. What I think becomes more complicated is when we start thinking of cash transfer programs as a long-term way out of poverty. So a lot of the discussions, for instance, right now on these universal basic income programs are almost have in them this idea that we can continue this for a long time, and this is the right thing to do in a society that has a lot of inequality. And I think a reasonable pushback is that the state should do a lot of redistribution. It should also do perhaps much more progressive taxation than it does. And it's the failure to do that that's leaving us with these options of cash transfers. And because I think a lot of these cash transfer programs that we're seeing pushed successfully right now are ones which are kind of prototype experimental evaluations. And I remember actually hearing an interesting description of someone talking about trying to get villages in Kenya to sign on to having these cash transfer programs. And they described that the local government said, fine, you can do the cash transfers in our village, but then you have to let us tax the recipients who get it, because these are going to become some of the richest members of the village. And that didn't meet what you wanted to do in an evaluation. So you in some ways kind of didn't test them in the villages that actually had a good system of redistribution. So I almost think if you really want to make a case for cash transfer programs, we have to understand how is this actually going to function together with the regular role of the state as redistribution. Is this sort of pre-tax income we want to give individuals and then say that's a windfall, you do what you want, but then you're going to be taxed? Or is this sort of some kind of long-term handout? Or the third, as I said, it's an extremely important tool in humanitarian circumstances. Some would say it's also a good comparison point for other types of interventions, right? So tell us that it does at least better than a cash transfer. I think that's a reasonable way to go, but that doesn't in itself say that we should do cash transfers.
Can I comment on this? I mean, the political problem is that voters have been told for a long time that development aid is about teaching someone to fish. And this feels very much to them as though you're just giving out fish. And nobody ever explained to the British public that they would be trying to run a social security program, which is what it feels to them like in Ethiopia or Kenya or Pakistan. I mean, it feels very, very odd to people who may feel that their own incomes are in trouble in Britain and may in fact be themselves recipients of various forms of social welfare support, to then be paying their own tax money to support a social welfare program in somebody else's country, because it feels also to them as though they're on the hook forever. I mean, because the people they're giving money to are often, by definition, the least productive members of society. They may be the elderly, they may be disabled people. It goes totally against what they were brought up to believe, which is that their development investment was going to have this sort of magnificent transformatory effect. You know, they build a road or something and suddenly the economy takes off and they don't need to be there anymore.
The Americans had a version of this, that we were offering aid not as a hand up, not as a hand out. And it's a lesson that then requires completely reversing course. And I think for many of the same political reasons that Rory mentioned.
I might want to close with this question. We have just 5 minutes left, and I love this point someone made here in the Zoom chat. Greg Larson, if you're okay with me sharing your name, poses this question. He says, "This is fascinating, but is focused mostly on what donor governments should do differently. What is your sense of how aid recipient governments approach these issues? And if recipients could design development, how would they shape it?" I might even broaden that question to talk not just recipient governments, but recipients more broadly, as we kind of alluded to earlier. Again, we just have now 4 minutes. So any quick, maybe final thoughts from panelists, but maybe getting to this question, let's not just talk about donor governments and what they should do differently, but if recipients could design development, how would things look different? I thought that was a really, really great point.
It's a great point. So let me jump in quickly. I think one thing I would say is leverage. For most, at least larger developing countries, aid is a very small part. And so I think what would be great is if they can figure what is the place where the leverage that aid would give you. And maybe sometimes it's technical expertise, maybe sometimes it's some place where you're really missing the last 10% of funding. And you can try to push to use aid not as something that's going to give you one more program on girls going to school, but actually strategically leveraging it where you need. And I'd also say that I think it's important for us to start thinking about, as we see increasing decentralization in these countries, how can we start bringing in more local players into this conversation? I think that's very hard. National governments would tell you that what they want is aid should come to them and they should be in charge of how to spread it. But I think thinking about how to actually push this conversation to include other people would be valuable.
Thank you.
I think one other issue, and this is kind of building from Rohini's, is that donors tend to want to have physical objects or empirical results that they can share from a project that they run on their own. And so the task of a recipient government or other recipients is to essentially orchestrate a variety of different projects and try and bring things together. This may help with Roy's, I thought, astute point about how academics tend to analyze rather than synthesize. So try and draw on the variety of resources rather than follow your donors where they want to go.
Great.
I just add, following on from David and Rohini, that one way that I'd be tempted to think about it is in terms of using the money to do things that your own taxpayers' money is reluctant to do. So try to see this money. I mean, because as Rohini says, I mean, if you look at Nigeria, for example, the DFID program of 400 million feels a lot to Britain. It's not very much to Nigeria, because the Nigerian GDP is 1,000 times that. So it's about maybe, they could be, for example, an environmental project, could be a cultural heritage project. Projects where you can say to your own people, don't worry, you are not paying with your taxpayers' money to restore this wetland or to invest in speculative research into wind power or to engage in a great program of cultural heritage restoration. Your money is going on the things that you really care about, health, education, etc. Effectively, this is free money from donors coming in, and we're going to direct that towards more interesting, unusual, peculiar projects, which your own taxpayers may be a little bit reluctant to take on, perhaps even more risky projects. I mean, I think one of the great things for a politician is to be able to do projects that can go wrong, and that's very difficult to do with your own taxpayers' money. So maybe use development donors' money for that.
Thank you, Rory. There are some questions we weren't able to get to, and I apologize for that, but thank you all for sending in such thoughtful questions and reactions to the conversation today. I found this to be a really valuable conversation and framing. I think this idea of bringing together history and practice into a conversation is something I don't see happening enough in the world of international development, and that's part of the problem, as we discussed. So I thank the organizers of this conversation for really taking the initiative to bring us all together. So thank you to our participants, thank you to our speakers for joining us. And as mentioned earlier, this is just the first in a series, so please stay tuned for more from the South Asia Development Dialogues, Economic Policy Lessons from History.